welcome.
Hi.
So Natasha centers on the kind of world that you grew up in an immigrant family in suburban Toronto. And I know your recent novels have been set all over the world, but was anything particularly inspiring you to come back to this setting as an artist?
Yeah. As you said, I wrote it originally, published in 2004, and did it and wrote those stories because nothing had really been done about that community. So this Russian-speaking community in Toronto, but also North America. And I came back to the story because I wanted to do the same thing in film, which nothing had really been done authentically to show these people depicted the way they are. And there was something about the story. I mean, if you want to make a film, you need a plot. And I always felt that, what attracted people originally to the story was this character of Natasha, who was kind of mysterious and compelling. And then the fact that there really is, an interesting plot in it. These two people come together and you do wonder, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen between the two of them and what effect will it have on the family? And I thought you could play that out on the screen as well.
Let's talk about Mark and Natasha. They're teenagers, they're cousins, but they come from...
Cousins by marriage.
That's an important point. Cousins by marriage, but they come from quite different worlds. Could you talk a little bit about the divide between their experiences and their cultures?
I think that's a good point. Well, they come from the same worlds at different times. Mm-hmm. So I think that's another distinction when we talk about immigrant communities and refugees coming. There's the community at large that, wonders how the refugees are going to fit in, et cetera. But I also think, anybody who's part of an immigrant community knows that there are different waves of immigration and that those communities don't always integrate very well, or there's suspicion and conflict between waves. So Mark's family came earlier, right? He came as a little boy, and his family has now established themselves and live in the suburbs and have, a successful Canadian North American life. Mm-hmm. And then this young girl comes with her mother to marry Mark's uncle. Also, it's not a love marriage; it's a marriage of convenience because they're coming from, a Russia that right now is economically distressed, and there are push factors leading them here. And they're just different. I mean, their mentality is different than what the Burmans are. They're hungrier. They're coming from a place where they had to survive and be canny in a way that the Burmans don't have to anymore. And I think that is part of the clash between the two of them. They're from the same place, but really the important thing is
still a very different experience.
Still a different experience.
Yeah. Is there something poignant to you about that difference in that particular relationship between Mark and Natasha?
I mean, I think what was interesting, when I was thinking about the story originally, it was in the 90s, and that was when the Soviet Union was collapsing. And there were stories about, young women who were being exploited, but also who were taking advantage of what they could with their sexuality, marrying for convenience, et cetera. And that sort of personality, if you were to drop that into, a conventional North American household, what would happen? And I thought in those terms, what would happen if somebody like that was dropped into my family? And the sort of kid that I was, roughly, I wasn't dealing that much drugs. In fact, I wasn't when I was 16. But what would happen? And she was compelling to me for that reason. I think she was to readers too.
I want to ask you about your experience growing up in a moment, but first you brought up waves of immigration and how the experience within people immigrating from the same country, same place can be so different depending on time. Yeah. Now, this story, originally published in 2004, and you've set the film decades later.
Right.
What was that like?
So the first question you have to ask is, can it still work? Can you take a story that's set in the 90s and update it to the present day? And I did update it for a couple of reasons. One is the answer was, yeah, I think it's still relevant. And in fact, from the time that we shot to now when the film was released, it's become more relevant because the situation in Russia has actually devolved because of sanctions, because of the invasion of Ukraine, and because of what's happened with oil prices. So economically, Russia now resembles Russia of the 1990s more than it ever has before. And so ordinary people are suffering in a way that they hadn't for a while. And then the other question is there is an element of dealing with pornography in this story. Natasha, as a girl, had gotten involved in this and had affected her. And that was one sort of situation in the 90s, but pornography's changed. with the advent of the internet, et cetera.
It's very much a present reality.
It's very much a present reality in the 90s. Back in the story, she says, to him at one point, I couldn't show him anything, right? She couldn't show me anything. Well, that's really not plausible anymore. I mean, this stuff is everywhere. And so visually, that was, a potential that you could play with also in the film. All of a sudden, he could see some of what had happened, and it has this effect on him as well.
And you've had some experience as well working in that porn world. Is that right?
My experience in the porn world, we're gonna bring it up.
Well, you brought it up.
Yes. So as a young man living in Los Angeles, hungry for experience and widening my horizons, I had a friend who was actually a Canadian guy who moved out there, and he was directing a porn film. I was at film school at the time, and I had studied sound. And I borrowed sound equipment from my university, the prestigious University of Southern California, and worked as a sound guy on a porn set for 3 days. And that's really where that's where the origin of the story comes from, because there was a Russian guy who was overseeing an office that we were shooting in. He had nobody to talk to. The director was one Russian speaker, I was the other. Director was busy directing. I was standing around. You don't need to do much as a sound man on a porn shoot, in case people are curious about that. And so he started talking to me and telling me stories, and told me the story of his wonderful trip back to Russia and going to this dacha, like a cottage, and seeing this happen, where a director friend of his was now basically making child pornography, and how wonderful it was. And that's where I started wondering, what is the story? Who are these girls and boys, but girls in this instance? And what would it be like if one of them, as I said before, were to land on these shores and fall into a family?
Had you seen that story represented before in film, in fiction, of what's going on in Russia in terms of child pornography?
Not so much child pornography, but there was, at the time, there was, and there still is this idea of, sexual slavery and women being, lured out of the former Soviet Union to become prostitutes. And true. But the child element, no, not so much. And it wasn't that really the pornographic part of it wasn't really the big issue. It was the sort of girl that would do this and what effect it would have on her. The maturity of it, and also the vulnerability, the combination of those two things. She's very grown up, Natasha, but she's still a child.
I want to ask you now about your experience growing up in Canada. You moved from Latvia to Canada as a kid. What was your family situation like when you moved?
So we came here, it was 1980, and it was me and my parents. I'm an only child. And we came here. We didn't know anybody here. We came with my uncle and aunt and a cousin, and my parents spoke no English. And had to start from scratch, and came with nothing. At the time, you left the Soviet Union. These were Soviet Jews, because they were the only ones who were allowed to leave at the time. And, they came with nothing. You were allowed to leave with $300. And people settled in this neighborhood, which is where we shot the film, northern Toronto, Bathurst and Steeles, and established our lives.
Do you know why your family ended up in Canada?
Oh, it's sort of an anecdote. We weren't intending to go there, but we met a guy, my father, a friend of his, when we were in Italy. We were being processed as refugees, and the guy was acting as an interpreter, and my father knew him, and he said, Canada's opened up. And for, as these things, they wax and wane. And my father was a sports guy, and he'd watched the Super Series in '72. And Canada just seemed good. It seemed like the land of opportunity, and we went.
It's funny, I was preparing for this interview yesterday, and we're kind of sharing some stories around the office about how we ended up in Canada, and it's similar to that. I mean, this wasn't a time with the internet where you could really thoroughly research a place. A lot of it came down to whatever associations you had.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And you were coming from the Soviet Union. It wasn't just you couldn't research. You were all you knew for the most part was spin, right? Was Soviet spin, and so you actually knew wrong things.
For you as a kid, what was the hardest part of fitting in?
I'd have to say it was class more than culture. I think it was not having money, and I think feeling that compared to some of the schoolmates I had, more than the culture itself, as I remember it now. And because the culture you acquire quickly as a kid, you pick up language pretty quickly. You can do all those things. Yeah. But I think the class issue, which you feel and also feeling that your parents are vulnerable. I think that's also tough.
You had a sense of that as a kid, even.
Yeah, I think all kids do.
We talked about the differences between Mark and Natasha, but we see big differences in this film between Mark and the adults. The adults from Russia, they see Mark as lazy, a bit spoiled. Was that anything like your experience?
Well, I think that's probably also true of immigrants that come where the parents come, they work hard, man. They work really hard. And the kids benefit from that and don't have to work as hard. And by the time the parents establish themselves, that sort of work ethic isn't there for the kids. And in fact, part of it is, you can attribute that to parents because they worked so hard to shelter you. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a big difference. You're just not as hungry.
When did you find the hunger?
I think I found education was always very important. You had to go to school, you had to become a professional, et cetera. I mean, the hunger for me is I wanted to do this, I wanted to write, and ultimately create films. And you got to be hungry to do it because, I mean, anything in life is tough. Mm-hmm. Even if you want to be a doctor, it's tough. But getting into this sort of thing, getting into the arts, the odds are stacked against you so much that you better be hungry.
What were other tensions that you found between your generation and your parents' generation in your community?
I think I'm probably somewhat of an anomaly in my community. I think artists usually are. I think most kids of my generation did what their parents wanted them to do, which is they became professionals and lead lives like that. So I don't know if there are tremendous tensions between these generations, honestly. I think, the extent to which people shed their Russian identity, their Russian-speaking identity, maybe there's some of that. But for the most part, it's been a successful immigration. And as I look around, I think there's the parents are basically proud of their kids, and the kids, have provided for their parents most of what they wanted.
What about later waves of immigration in your community? Do you get the sense it's been harder or easier for people who arrived a decade later, 2 decades later? It's
been different. People who came post-Soviet, first of all, they would have come with resources. They would have come with money. Not immediately post-Soviet, because those people would have been leaving a country that was falling apart. I think the big difference, and this is what's interesting about, let's say, the 1990s and now, is there's a critical mass of Russian speakers, and I think that's probably true of multiple communities, where when we came, I didn't hear any Russian around. If I heard Russian, it was at home. Now, there are self-sustaining communities. There are Russian schools. There are people here, younger people, who probably, can get by a lot in Russian. Institutions have existed. There's more media. And again, that's the change in Toronto. I mean, one thing when I think about the story and the impact that it's had is I think it's people of my generation who had a different experience of immigration. Our generation, I think it's true, where we're like the Trudeau era immigrants, right? Where all of a sudden the country became more multi-ethnic and diverse. Mm-hmm. And you saw more of these communities. And this story where you have, a kid speaking English back to the parents who are speaking whatever their indigenous language is, that's a much more common experience, not just about Russian-speaking immigrants, but immigrants of our generation. Because all of a sudden the country changed, and you saw more and more of it. And I think you had more of these self-sustaining communities. And in time, the Asian community or the South Asian community, it wasn't like that 25 years ago.
So you're saying in time they've become, these communities have become very self-sustaining?
I think they have. I think you can. You can have much more self-sustaining communities because you have the numbers are there and the institutions have been built up, and they weren't when we came here.
What do you think about that?
I think it's great. So insofar as we appreciate what it is that drew us here in the first place. I think retaining who you are, knowing your roots is essential. I don't see any reason why you should shed that. Mm-hmm. But I also think it's important to appreciate what it is that this country has provided and enabled us to establish these communities in the way that we've been able to. So walking that line, I think we as a country have to really be aware of that and supporting these communities and people within the communities knowing that these values are important.
Now, the past year has seen a lot of debate around the plight of refugees and immigrants. As someone who writes about people who've left their home and who's made a movie involving the complexities of living between worlds, what's been on your mind as you've watched the news in the last year or two around these issues?
Well, two things. One is being hospitable is great. I think we watched an election cycle that was very much about that, and we watch the United States right now going through an election cycle that still deals with that. And I think that we did the right thing as a country, that our attitude was the right attitude. But I also, as somebody who's been an immigrant and has, lived within a community, like even with this film, you see the conflict between immigrants of the same kind. I think it's hard. It's hard to adapt to a country. And I think none of us should be naive about that it's going to be easy. And I think, we have to put the work in.
What are some of the complexities that you think people miss about that experience, that challenge of adapting to a new country?
The next day, day two. Day two is hard. And day 3 and day 4, when you can't get a job and when it's hard to acquire the language. It's nice. Trudeau's there and we give flowers to the people in winter jackets. It's beautiful. But it's like the next day and the next day and the next day. That's when it's hard. And that goes on for a while. And it's what's happening with these people, depending on where they've come from, what's happening to the people they've left behind at home. I mean, if we're talking about Syria, it's not good, right? I mean, they're worried about their family members. It's hard.
The day-to-day experience is
the day-to-day experience is really hard. Yeah.
This film feels quite timely in light of these sorts of conversations that are going on. Was that part of the inspiration for making this film now?
I can't say that it was. I mean, I really wanted to do something about this community, and I thought the story was still interesting. But when you try to do something about the present day, when you want to be contemporary, you open yourself up to any sort of thing happening. Either things go completely awry, and what you thought was, something that was timely, all of a sudden, the situation changes, or it goes the other way. And I think, whether it's because there's more of a conversation about refugees, whether it's because of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, I think the film has become more timely over its gestation period.
Well, thank you so much for joining me here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.